Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask our in-house guests if you'll make that courtesy check one last time that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. It's always appreciated. For those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post today's program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference. We, of course, have copies of today's book available for sale, and I know our author will be glad to sign them and talk with you further after today's program. But initiating our program will be Michaela Dodge, who is Senior Policy Analyst for Defense and Strategic Policy, part of our Center for National Defense. She specializes in missile defense, nuclear weapons modernization, and arms control. Her research and commentaries have been featured not only on our own blogs here at Heritage, but online in such venues as foxnews.com and the Daily Caller, as well as other print media. She holds her Master of Sciences degree in Defense and Strategic Studies from Missouri State University, and she received a bachelor's degree in International Relations and Defense and Strategic Studies from Masaryk University in Czech Republic. Please join me in welcoming Michaela Dodge. Michaela?
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, John. Thank you so much for coming, everyone, and those joining us online. It is my pleasure to welcome back Matt Cronick, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. And Matt is one of the few and far between up-and-coming nuclear scholars or established nuclear scholars producing and writing original, creative research on nuclear deterrence, which is always very tough with international security topics, and especially as prominent ones as nuclear weapons, particularly during Cold War. He's held numerous academic fellowships, has been funded by Carnegie Corporation, is a lifetime member of a Council on Foreign Relations, and is very, very accomplished in this field. And we're very glad to have him here to present his book, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. And Matt will be available to sign the book after the event if you're interested in purchasing it. There are copies available in the lobby. Earlier I joked with Matt that, your kid sleeps well when you publish a book with a newborn. So that's a testament to that, but also his dedication and his hard work on the project. So Matt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Michaela, for that introduction. Thanks to the Heritage Foundation for hosting me here today. It's always a pleasure to be back in this beautiful auditorium. And thanks to all of you for coming out today and spending your time discussing nuclear strategy. So I'm here to talk about my new book, and unfortunately, I think nuclear weapons are back in the news. North Korea is on the verge of becoming only the third U.S. rival with the ability to threaten nuclear war against the U.S. homeland. Russia is relying more on nuclear weapons in its strategy. The risk of nuclear war with Russia is probably higher now than at any time since the end of the Cold War. And great power politics with China are heating up. And China, of course, is a nuclear-armed power, so nuclear deterrence is relevant to that challenge. So this raises an important question, an enduring question, but a question with renewed relevance, which is what kind of nuclear strategy and posture does the United States need to protect itself and its allies? But this also raises a bigger question, I think, for international relations scholars, which is why is there such a big gap in this area between theory and practice? Because we have existing theories that answer this question. The existing theories that anybody who's taken an Introduction to International Relations course knows is that the United States needs a second strike capability. As long as the United States can absorb a nuclear attack, respond with a devastating counterattack, then we can deter any rational adversary. Nuclear deterrence will hold, will be a situation of mutually assured destruction, and that's all the United States needs. And anything more than that is unnecessary overkill. So it's a very clear theory. We've all learned it. The only problem is it doesn't explain the real world. If you look at actual U.S. nuclear strategy, the United States has never been content with a mere second strike capability. If a mere second strike capability were enough, the United States would have a couple dozen, maybe 100 nuclear warheads on submarines, and that would be sufficient. But the United States has always had thousands of nuclear weapons, counterforce policies and capabilities, missile defenses, and more broadly has shown an interest in military nuclear advantages over rivals. So in 1963, President Kennedy said the United States should have a nuclear arsenal, quote, second to none. President Trump just last year said the United States should have a nuclear arsenal at the top of the pack. Hillary Clinton in 2010, then Secretary of State, said the United States will be stronger than everybody else, as we've always been, with way more nuclear weapons than are needed many times over. So this raises a puzzle. Our theories say we only need to secure a second strike, but the United States has always been interested in this more robust nuclear posture. So how do we explain this? Well, scholars have looked at this gap between theory and policy, and they say the answer is simple. U.S. policymakers are wrong. The theories are right, the real world's wrong. And in fact, Robert Jervis, esteemed professor of international relations at Columbia University, wrote an entire book in 1984 called The Illogic of American Nuclear Strategy. Well, in this book, I take a different approach. It's called The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy, and I try to explain why it is logical for the United States to have this more robust nuclear force. And in short, I argue that this more robust nuclear force allows the United States to limit damage to itself and to its allies in the event of a nuclear conflict. This increases U.S. bargaining power in high-stakes crises and enhances nuclear deterrence and extended nuclear deterrence, makes it more likely that allies or adversaries challenge us in the first place. So over the next few minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit more about this conventional wisdom of what we think we know about U.S. nuclear strategy. Next, I'd like to lay out my argument in some more detail about the logic of American nuclear strategy. Third, I'll make some arguments, show some evidence about the benefits of this more robust nuclear posture. Next, I'll turn to the disadvantages, because critics of U.S. nuclear strategy have said not only does it not make sense to have a robust nuclear posture, that it doesn't provide anything in terms of deterrence, but also that there are downside risks, that it upsets strategic stability with great powers, that it leads to arms races, that it causes nuclear proliferation, that it's too expensive. So I consider these downside risks, because if it's truly the case that there are these big geostrategic costs to maintaining a robust nuclear posture, then we're back at the same puzzle. Why has the United States possessed this robust nuclear posture if there are all of these costs? And I'll argue that, in fact, these costs have been exaggerated by critics of U.S. nuclear strategy, that there are some costs, but that they pale in comparison to the benefits provided by this more robust nuclear force. So again, the conventional wisdom, second strike theory, mutually assured destruction, whatever you'd like to call it, is what all my colleagues teach in universities, what many of you have probably learned. I think many people in the national security community, when they think about nuclear deterrence, this is what they think about. Again, that the United States needs a second strike capability. So if we had a nuclear arsenal where our opponent could launch a nuclear first strike and disarm us, that would be a problem. Therefore, we need nuclear weapons on submarines and hardened ballistic missile silos, dispersed enough that even if an enemy conducts a nuclear first strike, our nuclear arsenal can survive, and we can retaliate with a devastating second strike. And they argue as long as your opponent has a second strike capability as well, then you're in this situation of mutually assured destruction. Both sides can inflict incredible damage, even if the other side goes first. And so this leads to stability and to the deterrence of great power war. Now, these scholars weren't naive. They didn't think that international conflict ends with mutually assured destruction, so they argued that essentially leaders in nuclear-armed states face a dilemma. On one hand, they don't want to intentionally launch a potentially suicidal nuclear war. On the other hand, they don't just want to back down in conflicts with nuclear-armed states. They don't want to give their adversaries a free pass just because they have nuclear weapons and they're afraid of nuclear conflict. And so they've argued that the space in between is nuclear brinkmanship. They argue that essentially countries play games of nuclear chicken, raising the risk of nuclear war in crises in an attempt to force their adversaries to back down. So they make nuclear threats, put nuclear weapons on high alert, use conventional force, other things to raise the risks for their adversary to force them to capitulate. So you can think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin Crisis, Suez Crisis, Sino-Soviet border war, cargo crisis between India and Pakistan. We've seen dozens of these high-stakes crises between nuclear-armed states. But the traditional scholarship, the traditional conventional wisdom on this says that nuclear capabilities don't matter to these games of nuclear chicken because a crash is bad for both sides. And so therefore they argue what really matters is the country's stakes, that one country will care more about the issue than the other, and so that country will be willing to run a greater risk of nuclear war. The other less resolved state will back down. So looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, they've said, well, the United States just cared more about the Cuban Missile Crisis. For us, Cuba is a small island just off the coast of Florida. It was more of a core interest. For the Soviet Union, it was about projecting geopolitical influence in a distant region. We cared more. We were willing to run a greater risk. Therefore, the Soviet Union backed down. And again, they say that nuclear capabilities are irrelevant to this situation. American nuclear superiority in the Cuban Missile Crisis, they argue, didn't matter. So again, this leads us to our puzzle. Why then does the United States want superiority? Why has it always had this robust nuclear posture when theories say it doesn't matter? Again, the theorists have said policymakers are wrong, and I argue if we want to be real social scientists, if we want to try to explain the world as it is, then what we need is a better theory. We can't say facts don't fit the theory, let's dismiss the facts. If the theory don't fit the facts, then we need a better theory. So what is unique about American nuclear strategy that the traditional scholarship has overlooked? And I think there are at least a couple of things. So one is counterforce nuclear targeting. Because in these kind of simple models of mutually assured destruction, what people have in mind is, we aim our nuclear weapons at the enemy's cities. We threaten to slaughter a lot of people in Moscow or Beijing. They aim nuclear weapons at our cities, threaten to slaughter a lot of people in Washington, Los Angeles, and New York. Both sides are afraid of that kind of conflict, and so this leads to stability. The problem is the United States hasn't done counter-value targeting, purposely targeting population centers, arguably ever, but certainly not for decades. Instead, the United States does counterforce nuclear targeting. So the United States plans to use our nuclear weapons to destroy the enemy's nuclear weapons. So we target Russian ballistic missile silos, Russian submarine bases, Russian air bases, Chinese, North Korean, et cetera, command and control centers, legitimate military targets. And we do this for a number of reasons. The first reason is moral and legal. International law says that countries must distinguish between legitimate military targets and civilian targets. So you must distinguish between those types of targets, and any attack must be proportional to the ends sought. So some countries don't care about this. We think that China's nuclear strategy is essentially a counter-value strategy, that they plan to aim their nuclear weapons at US cities and slaughter a lot of people. But that's not the way the United States thinks about it. We target only legitimate military targets to remain compliant with the international laws of armed conflict. And you can look at President Obama's 2013 nuclear employment guidance to the Department of Defense for a very clear statement of this, that the United States does counterforce nuclear targeting for these legal and moral reasons. There's a second reason we do counterforce targeting as well, and this is a strategic reason, so-called damage limitation. And the idea is simple. Every Russian nuclear weapon we destroy in a silo in Russia is a nuclear weapon that's not falling on US territory, not falling on Allied territory. So the goal of limiting damage in the event of nuclear war has always been a part of US nuclear strategy. Of course, the purpose is to deter war in the first place, but God forbid if deterrence fails, we want to protect Americans, protect our allies. So you can look at the recent Trump nuclear posture review released just a few weeks ago that talks about damage limitation as an important role of US nuclear strategy. But you can go back. President Carter's Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, also said that it's important, the United States has always considered it important, to target the adversary nuclear forces that could do damage to us and our allies. Now this has implications for force requirements. If our strategy were just to kill a lot of people in Moscow and Beijing, maybe a handful of nuclear weapons would be enough. But if we want to do counterforce targeting, destroy air bases, missile silos, submarine bases, command and control, then that increases the number of targets and increases the number of US nuclear weapons that are needed to cover those targets. So as adversary nuclear weapons increase, U.S. nuclear weapons need to increase to cover those targets. As adversary nuclear weapons come down, American nuclear weapons can come down because there are fewer targets to cover. And moreover, military planners are cautious. What if a missile misses? What if the warhead doesn't go off? What if the warhead doesn't go off or goes off but doesn't destroy the target? So as a rule of thumb, outside analysts have often assumed 2 U.S. nuclear warheads for every enemy nuclear target. So if you count up the number of enemy nuclear targets, kind of open source, multiply by 2. I do this in the book. I get to roughly the 2,000 or so nuclear weapons that the United States has in its arsenal today. So this is the first thing that's unique about U.S. nuclear strategy that these traditional theories overlook, counterforce targeting. The second is extended nuclear deterrence. So Russia, China, other countries use their nuclear weapons to deter nuclear attacks against themselves. The United States doesn't do that. The United States uses its nuclear weapons to deter attacks against the entire free world. The United States extends its nuclear security guarantee, extends its nuclear umbrella to 30 other countries, at least 30 other countries. So the 27 other members of NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, arguably others, rely on America's nuclear weapons for their own security. So if you're, again, trying to deter attacks against 1/4 of the Earth, you need a more robust nuclear posture than if you're deterring attacks only against yourself. So I think the traditional arguments are right that nuclear armed states find themselves in these games of nuclear chicken. But what's different about American nuclear strategy is that we're essentially promising to be prepared every day, if necessary, to play a game of nuclear chicken on behalf of Estonia against Russia, to play a game of nuclear chicken, if necessary, on behalf of Japan against China, to play a game of nuclear chicken, if necessary, on behalf of South Korea against North Korea, essentially to play a game of nuclear chicken every day on behalf of dozens of smaller allies against formidable nuclear-armed rivals. And in situations where the balance of stakes, at least arguably, always favors our rival. After all, I think there's a compelling story Putin can tell himself about why he should care more about Estonia than we do. There's a compelling story Xi can tell himself about why he cares more about East Asia than the United States does. A compelling story that Kim Jong-un can tell himself about why he cares more about South Korea than the United States does. So if these are games of chicken, the balance of stakes matters. The United States is starting off, at least arguably, with an endemic disadvantage in the balance of stakes. And the logic of American nuclear strategy, I argue, essentially is to make up for our stakes deficit with a capabilities advantage. We're promising to play these games of nuclear chicken potentially every day. And if you're going to play a game of nuclear chicken every day, you'd rather drive a Hummer than a Prius. And so this is essentially the logic of American nuclear strategy, what I call in the book the superiority brinkmanship synthesis theory. But basically, if in a game of nuclear chicken, you might expect the smaller car to swerve first, even if a crash would be disastrous for both. So imagine yourself driving these cars. Imagine if you were playing a game of chicken in the Hummer or the Prius. Would you behave differently? Would you be more likely to swerve, less likely to want to play in the first place if you had to drive one car or the other? I know I certainly would. So what we should expect then is that, on balance, countries in an inferior position are going to be more likely to swerve in these games of chicken, more likely to back down, and they're going to be less likely to play in the first place. Why play a game of nuclear chicken if you're likely to lose? And as Thomas Schelling said, the Nobel Prize award-winning economist and nuclear strategist, if you're asked to play a game of nuclear chicken and you say, "No thanks, I'd rather not," you've just played. So this is a political science book. It aims to bridge the gap between political science and policy debates. And so if this logic is right, then we should expect a few things. The first thing we should expect is that there are meaningful differences in nuclear war outcomes, that having a more robust nuclear posture can meaningfully limit damage to the United States and its allies. Because after all, if in a crash both the Hummer and the Prius are totaled, then it doesn't much matter which car you're driving. But if the damage you suffer depends on the car you're driving, then it makes a difference. So in the book, I have a chapter where I do a number of nuclear exchange calculations, contemporary calculations of what a nuclear exchange with the United States and its adversaries might look like today. So I look at a U.S. exchange with Russia, with China, with North Korea, and I look at scenarios both where the adversary goes first and hits the United States with a massive first strike, and scenarios where the United States goes first, conducts a damage-limiting strike, protects itself with missile defenses, and then compare what the outcomes look like. And the outcome is pretty simple for any of you who've ever kind of seen these calculations. Essentially, the more enemy nuclear weapons we're facing, the worse damage we suffer, we and our allies suffer. So a nuclear war with China is worse than a nuclear war with North Korea, and a nuclear war with Russia is worse than a nuclear war with China. A second thing I find is that the United States does have meaningful damage limitation capabilities. A nuclear war where the enemy hits us first always looks worse than a nuclear war where the United States is able to go first, limit damage, blunt the adversary's capabilities, and again, limit damage to ourselves and our allies. So I just put up a couple of examples here. This is an example of what a Russian nuclear first strike on the United States might look like compared to what a Chinese second strike might look like. And of course, it depends a bit on your assumptions. So according to the conventional wisdom, these traditional theories of mutually assured destruction, these are the same scenarios. We're vulnerable to nuclear attack in both scenarios. This is a situation of mutually assured destruction. It doesn't much matter. But as you can see, one of these scenarios is much worse than the other. To argue that these are exactly the same, you would have to argue that it doesn't matter whether 50 million Americans live or die, doesn't matter whether dozens of US cities are directly targeted in a nuclear attack or not. So if you're trying to defend an entrenched position, maybe you could make this case. But I think for most people, whether 50 million Americans live or die is important. And for leaders, it's important. It's implausible to think that American leaders responsible for protecting the country don't care whether 50 million Americans live or die. So that's the first premise of the argument. There are meaningful differences in nuclear war outcomes, even if both sides have a second strike capability. Now, the next thing we might expect, the next kind of hypothesis, is that in these high-stakes games of chicken, we should expect the inferior state to swerve first, that the superior state's going to be more likely to get its way. So in the book, I look at some quantitative analysis and some qualitative analysis. So for the quantitative analysis, I go to the International Crisis Behavior Dataset. It's a dataset housed at the University of Maryland. They collected data on every international crisis from 1816 to the present, and they code which participants in these crises achieve their basic goals and which countries in these crises don't achieve their basic goals. And so all I did was take their data set and limit it to the crises between two nuclear-armed states. And then I just coded a simple variable for nuclear superiority by warhead count, which country had more warheads in the crisis. So here's a table showing the results. Direct your attention to the win column, and if you go all the way to the bottom, what you see is this number 35%. So we can see in 35% of these crises, a country achieves its basic goals. So this means in 65% of the cases, neither country is achieving its basic goals. It's ending in defeat or compromise or stalemate. But 35% of the time, a country achieves its goals. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States achieved its goal of getting the Soviet Union to withdraw its missiles. Second thing I draw your attention to, though, is that the superior countries are doing better. According to this data set, countries in a position of nuclear superiority have achieved their goals in these crises 54% of the time, which is much better than 35%, the average winning percentage, and much better than 15%, which is the winning percentage of the countries in the inferior position. So this suggests, again, that nuclear superior states are more likely to achieve their goals in these high-stakes crises. Now, some of you with a statistics background may say, well, there are other confounding factors. What about conventional military power? What about stakes? And so I also do some more complicated regression analysis and find the same basic pattern. On average, countries in a position of superiority are more likely to achieve their goals in these crises. Now, some of you might be saying, okay, well, I'm not sure I trust these numbers when it comes to international politics. What about in actual cases? What do we find? So in the book, I look at some of the most important nuclear crises of the nuclear era. Cuban Missile Crisis, Sino-Soviet border war, a crisis that some people argue is the second closest after the Cuban Missile Crisis that humanity came to nuclear war. I look at the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, which the U.S. Department of State Office of the Historian says is the second closest the United States ever came to nuclear war. And then I look at the recent cargo war, 1999, between India and Pakistan. So in all these cases, we see a number of things. One, we see that the nuclear superior state achieves its goals. Second, we see that the nuclear superior state is more willing to play these games of nuclear chicken, more willing to put its nuclear weapons on high alert, more willing to make nuclear threats, more willing to push the crisis. In contrast, the inferior state is more eager to look for off-ramps. And also, we see that this is the way leaders talk about politics in the crisis. They're looking at the nuclear balance of power, talking about it, making arguments about how the nuclear balance of power should affect their country's willingness to push the crisis. So using the Cuban Missile Crisis as an example, of course, the United States had a large nuclear superiority in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a situation of so-called mutually assured destruction. The Soviet Union had the ability to strike the eastern seaboard of the United States with nuclear weapons, even if the United States went first. But the United States had about a 17-to-1 nuclear advantage, and this was recognized by all sides. The United States was more willing to push the crisis. Many Americans don't realize this, but the Cold War is the closest the United States ever came to nuclear war because the United States was willing to step out on the brink, not the Soviet Union. The United States went to DEFCON 2, put its nuclear weapons on high alert, made a number of implicit and explicit nuclear threats. In contrast, the Soviet Union didn't put its nuclear forces on alert. Richard Betts, a scholar at Columbia University, said it was equivalent to a threatened dog rolling belly up, a really remarkable aspect of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And U.S. leaders understood their nuclear advantage and argued that it mattered. So Secretary of State Dean Rusk, in a meeting with the ExComm, with Kennedy, said, we have a substantial nuclear superiority. One thing Khrushchev may know is that we don't live under the fear of his nuclear weapons to the same extent that he lives under the fear of our nuclear weapons. Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, wrote a memo to Secretary of Defense McNamara saying, we have an advantage in our general war capabilities, general war being a euphemism for nuclear war at the time. We have an advantage in our general war capabilities. Now is not the time to run scared. And we see similar dynamics in these other cases. Now, the final thing we might expect is that if nuclear superiority provides these advantages, then countries with robust nuclear postures like the United States should be less likely to be challenged in the first place. After all, why start a crisis? Why pick a game of chicken if you're only going to lose in the end? So to look at this, I looked at so-called military compellent threats. Because I have some scholars, some colleagues, Matt Furman at Texas A&M, Todd Sexer at University of Virginia, who wrote a good book last year with Cambridge University Press on nuclear coercion. And so they collected a data set of every military compellent threat from 1918 to the present. And they were interested in whether nuclear weapons matter for these compellent threats. So what they did is look at nuclear-armed states when they make these compellent threats, and what is their success rate, and then compare that to non-nuclear states when they make military compellent threats, and what is their success rate. And what they find is the success rate for both is about 20%. I think it's 23 to 20%, but they say statistically there's no difference here, so nuclear weapons don't matter for coercion. Now, I was somewhat skeptical of this given my work in this area, so I wanted to dig into this data a little bit more. And so one of the things that's driving their finding is that they have a lot of examples of non-nuclear states threatening non-nuclear states, many of them starting in 1918 before nuclear weapons are even invented. So I wasn't that interested in that, and so I thought, well, let's just focus on the cases of nuclear states making threats. What do we find there? So what I found is that according to their data, there are 49 examples of nuclear-armed states issuing these military compellent threats from 1945 to the present. Now, out of these 49 threats, how many of them do you think were made against countries with fewer nuclear weapons? And how many of them do you think were made against countries with more nuclear weapons? I'll show you. 49 to 0. According to their data, a data set used to show that nuclear weapons don't matter for coercion. Looking at it a little bit different, we see that nuclear weapons are actually all important for coercion. According to their data, never in the history of the world has a nuclear-armed state issued what they call a military compellent threat against a country with more nuclear weapons. So in other words, nuclear superiority deters these challenges in the first place. Well, what is the success rate? Yeah, 10 out of the 49 were successful. So you get to about that 20% success rate. So they're right on the success rate. The only problem is they're not looking at what the opponent's nuclear capabilities look like, and are you issuing these threats against superior or inferior states. So far we've seen that having a robust nuclear posture can provide meaningful damage limitation in the event of a nuclear war, that this enhances your leverage in high-stakes crises, makes the inferior state more likely to back down, and contributes to deterrence in the first place, makes it less likely that the inferior state wants to challenge you. But others have argued, well, there have to be some downside risks, that having a robust nuclear posture upsets strategic stability among the great powers, leads to arms races, leads to proliferation, costs too much. And so in the second half of the book, I look at these potential costs of a robust nuclear posture. So one of the arguments that critics of American nuclear strategy make is that having this robust nuclear posture potentially undermines strategic stability. That if we have a first strike capability, then our enemy, the position in an inferior, the country in an inferior position, might face so-called use them or lose them pressures. So for example, North Korea. A country like North Korea might fear that since we have a first strike capability, that their nuclear weapons could be completely wiped out. So therefore, rather than sitting back and waiting for their nukes to be wiped out, that they'll use nuclear weapons early in a conflict. So paradoxically, having this robust nuclear force can actually provoke nuclear wars, make nuclear wars more likely. So at a superficial level, this makes sense, but these arguments overlook a couple of things. One, they overlook the fact that the United States not only has a first strike capability, but also a second strike capability. So we could absorb that first strike and retaliate with the devastating second strike, in the case of North Korea, in the country and in the regime. The other thing they overlook is that the choice isn't between getting attacked in a nuclear war or attacking in a nuclear war. The choice is getting attacked, attacking, or looking for an off-ramp and living to fight another day. And so, any rational leader facing a choice between intentionally starting a nuclear war that leads to the end of your country versus backing down and living to fight another day, the rational choice is backing down and living to fight another day. And if we look at the empirical evidence in the first half of the book, I show time and time again inferior states have backed down. Never in the history of the world has a country intentionally started a nuclear war because it feared that its nuclear weapons were going to be wiped out. So strategic stability, if anything, is a benefit, I believe, of a robust nuclear posture, not a cost. Others argue arms races. If the United States has a robust nuclear posture, Russia, China, North Korea are just going to try to find similar capabilities. They're going to close the gap. We're going to get into an expensive arms race. It's going to lead to cycles of hostility. We'll be worse off in the end. Just looking at the empirical record, there's never been an arms race with China and North Korea. The United States has always had clear superiority over those countries. The United States has always had meaningful damage limitation against Russia, I would argue. And this may be politically incorrect to say, but sometimes arms races are necessary. If you have a dangerous adversary building capabilities to threaten you and your allies, then you need to arms race to deter that adversary. So thank God the United States arms raced during the Cold War. So arms races are sometimes a result of nuclear competition, but not a cost of a robust nuclear posture. Again, the United States has been able to have meaningful superiority over its rivals. Non-proliferation. Some argue that if the United States has a robust nuclear posture, then what kind of message are we sending to non-nuclear states? If the greatest conventional superpower on Earth needs nuclear weapons, then maybe Mexico, Indonesia, Egypt decide that they need to build nuclear weapons as well. And again, at a superficial level, this makes sense, but if you start to dig into it, the logic falls apart. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of Kim Jong-un. Is he telling himself, well, if the United States has 2,000 nuclear weapons, I'm going to build up my arsenal. But if they only had a secure second strike capability, if they only had 200 nuclear weapons, then I would stop my program. It seems kind of implausible that it's the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal driving Kim Jong-un's nuclear program. Moreover, U.S. nuclear weapons, I would argue, have been one of the most important forces for non-proliferation over the past 70 years. By extending our nuclear umbrella to our allies, We discourage allies from building their own nuclear weapons. If it weren't for America's nuclear umbrella, if it weren't for America's robust nuclear posture, it's very likely that Germany, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, many other countries would have their own nuclear weapons today. So rather than causing nuclear proliferation, I believe a robust nuclear posture in the United States stops proliferation, and that U.S. nuclear weapons are unique in this regard because of extended deterrence. Final argument people make is, well, this robust nuclear posture is just too expensive. We can't afford it. And as you probably know, the United States is modernizing its nuclear arsenal over the course of the next 30 years. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that this will cost about $1.3 trillion. Critics of American nuclear strategy have said, again, this is too much, we can't afford it. But putting this big number in context, and $1.3 trillion is a big number, but that comes to about 5 to 7% of the U.S. defense budget. So is 5 to 7% too much to spend on nuclear weapons? Well, Secretary of Defense Mattis says nuclear deterrence is the #1 priority of the U.S. Department of Defense. And in fact, every Secretary of Defense, past 4 or 5 going back to Hagel, have said the same thing. So in my view, 5 to 7% of the defense budget for the most important mission of the Department of Defense isn't too much, it's good value. And Obama's Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, agreed, saying that nuclear weapons don't actually cost that much. So what are the implications of this then? Well, one, for theory and scholarship, I think these traditional theories of mutually assured destruction, second strike capability, are not incorrect, but they're incomplete. I think they're right that countries are loath to intentionally start a suicidal nuclear war with another nuclear-armed state. I think they're right that countries get into these high-stakes games of nuclear chicken. I think they're also right that stakes matter to these games of nuclear chicken, but they're missing an important variable, the nuclear balance of power. I think we see in the quantitative and qualitative evidence that the nuclear balance of power matters. So these traditional scholars looking at a case like the Cuban Missile Crisis, Rusk and others talking about nuclear superiority, they say, well, they were foolish to be talking about that. Nuclear superiority doesn't matter. So maybe that's a good defense, again, of an entrenched position, but if you actually want to understand the crisis as it played out, you have to look at the factors the leaders themselves thought was important. And what does this mean for U.S. nuclear strategy? Well, I think good news for the American people. Our leaders aren't crazy. There's a good reason why U.S. leaders in both parties have pursued this more robust nuclear posture. And going forward, what does this mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that the United States needs to continue to maintain a robust nuclear posture. If the United States decided it wanted to throw the law of armed conflict out the window and go to counter-value targeting, intentionally slaughter, plan to slaughter innocent civilians as part of our nuclear strategy, if we decided we wanted to give up on extended deterrence, have a more isolationist foreign policy, let Asia and Europe go their own ways, let our allies build their own nuclear weapons. If we wanted to do those things, then I think we could have a smaller nuclear arsenal. We could just deter attacks on ourselves. But as long as the United States wants to continue to comply with international law, as long as the United States wants to continue to provide geopolitical stability in Europe and Asia, then the United States will continue to need a robust nuclear posture. So I'll end my presentation there and look forward to the question and answer.
Hi, my name's Alex. Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So, I just have a question about the current state of the United States military arsenal. It's not very good. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, our newest nuclear weapons were, in the 1980s, and that Russia has weapons that that have been made in like 2016, 2017. So currently, as is, like right now, today, like if we were to go into some kind of nuclear proliferation with Russia, how would our older nuclear weapons, like how would that affect the conflict and kind of like the dialogue between the two? Like, would it be bad? Like, would it be bad for us that our nukes are so old, or does it not really matter?
Yeah, great question. And I should say, my book focuses on this more fundamental logic of nuclear deterrence, but I'm very happy to talk about more contemporary issues, the new nuclear posture review, America, nuclear modernization, North Korea, Iran, et cetera. So thank you for that. It's interesting. President Kennedy was the first one to say that the United States needs a nuclear arsenal second to none. Just 2 weeks ago, when President Putin announced his new nuclear capabilities, Sarah Huckabee Sanders was asked about these capabilities, and she quoted Kennedy and said, "The United States nuclear arsenal is still second to none." So we have a formidable nuclear force, but we do need to modernize. So our nuclear weapons are old. They were built in the 70s or 80s. I don't know how many of you drive cars, but if you drive a car that was built in the 70s or 80s, you wouldn't expect it to start all the time. So we do need to modernize, and so that's why we've put in place this plan to modernize over the next 30 years. There's bipartisan support for that. It was started under the Obama administration. The Trump administration is planning to complete it. But it's important that we stay the course. Because I think there are those who criticize modernization, saying maybe we shouldn't do an ICBM, maybe we shouldn't do an LRSO. But I think it's very important that we follow through on plans to modernize the triad. And then also the Trump administration is adding these supplemental capabilities. And I think it's also very important that we see those through. The other issue I'll raise is that there is the New START treaty between the United States and Russia that caps both of our arsenals at 1,550 strategic deployed weapons. So because of that, we're locked in at strategic parity. I believe the United States has a number of qualitative advantages, including stealth and precision-guided munitions and other things. But I do worry about the future of the New START treaty. I think it's in our interest and in Russia's interest to keep this treaty in place. But Russia is violating a lot of its other legacy arms control agreements, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So will they continue to comply with New START, or will they break out and look to expand their nuclear arsenal? So I hope that they don't do that, but if so, the United States also needs to be prepared to expand its nuclear capabilities, because we don't want to be in a position of strategic inferiority with Russia. We need to maintain at least strategic parity.
I have a couple of questions, but I'll ask them in sequence so that I won't hog the floor. First question is, what does your book say about the direction of our current approach in terms of modernization, in terms of strategy? What would you say that we should be doing that we're not doing, and what would you say that we're doing that we maybe shouldn't be doing?
Great question. So in the conclusion of the book, I talk kind of explicitly about what some of the policy implications of this analysis are. And so the first thing I argue is, I say, what would an ideal U.S. nuclear posture look like? If we were just starting from scratch and designing it. And I essentially say, in terms of numbers of nuclear warheads, you need to count up the nuclear targets and our potential adversaries, multiply by 2. I'm sure the planners at Stratcom do it in a more sophisticated way, but on the outside, we use this rule of thumb of kind of 2 warheads per target. And if you do that, I come to roughly 2,500 actually, so which suggests that maybe we're a little bit on the low end with our current numbers. So many critics of American nuclear posture say, oh, it's massive overkill, having this many nuclear weapons. I worry that we're a little bit on the low side. It seems that we could possibly expand the arsenal. Although, again, to do the analysis in the best way possible, you would need access to the classified information on the targets, which I didn't have. I just did my best kind of open source analysis. So maybe the number's exactly right. I worry that maybe it's a little bit on the low end. But if you're doing nuclear strategy, like if you're playing basketball in March Madness, you need to play offense and defense. So I think there are also some things the United States could do to strengthen its defenses that would contribute to damage limitation. So I think some of the things being discussed right now make a lot of sense, having a third site, increasing the number of U.S. interceptors, looking at next generation technologies like directed energy on drones as a way to deal with North Korean missile launches. But the title of the book is The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. So in short, I think we're doing many of the right things, and part of the goal of this book is to just translate what the United States is doing and convince scholars and those in the academy that there is an underlying logic to a lot of this. It's not crazy to have 1,500 nuclear weapons, given what the United States is trying to do with them.
Oh, thank you. Hello, I'm David Charrington with the Advanced Nuclear Weapons Alliance. In this sort of period politically in the United States, where things seem to be a lot more, everything's is being politicized. It seems at every turn. And although our nuclear weapons program here has largely been supportive bipartisan for many decades, since its creation, it feels like there's not quite the bipartisan support necessarily for modernizing. And I'm also concerned, perhaps, is there complacency once you get away from. I hope everyone reads your book, because we need to be getting the word out. But is there some complacency, especially when we get outside of this city and so forth, where our students on college campus and so forth have as much knowledge and interest and understanding about our nuclear weapons? I appreciate your comments.
Yes, great question. So I'll take the last one first. What is the kind of public knowledge on this issue? What are students interested in it? So I think there has been a change for the better in the past couple of years. So I think there was this 25-year period after the end of the Cold War where people thought these are Cold War relics, who cares? When I first started at Georgetown in 2008, I taught a class on nuclear weapons, and I had, I can't remember, 13 or so students. Past few years, it's become a lecture course. I have 75 or so students. There's a wait list. So there's much more interest. Unfortunately, I think it's because of real-world events. I think President Putin and Kim Jong-un and others building their nuclear arsenals, making nuclear threats, has put it back on the front pages. But one of the positive benefits of that is I think students, once again, are interested in learning these issues. And I've even seen among the scholarly community more academics writing books on these issues, not always coming to the right conclusions, but at least I think starting debates that for the most part are getting people to think about these issues seriously again. In terms of the consensus in Washington, I do think in the center there is a bipartisan consensus, and many Republicans supported the Obama plans for modernization, and many Democrats now are supporting the Trump administration nuclear posture review. So John Harvey, who's with us today, was an official in the Obama administration who's come out in favor, supporting the Trump administration nuclear posture review. Brad Roberts, who was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Obama, said he supports the nuclear posture review, including modernization and the supplements. Jim Miller, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy for Obama, supports them. So I think there is still, in the center, serious people, and there is something of a bipartisan consensus. What I think makes this debate seem so skewed is you have all of these advocacy organizations on the far left that aren't serious, in my view. They're anti-nuclear advocates. They don't care what the argument is as long as it gets them to the conclusion that we should get rid of these things. And for whatever reason, they're given platforms in mainstream media to have these views. I mean, if there were the equivalent on the far right saying we should build back up to 30,000 nuclear weapons, no, they'd never see the light of day, but yet we give these extreme left-wing advocacy groups prominent places in the public debate that I don't think they deserve. I think we should be looking at what the serious people in the center are saying, and I think there still is bipartisan support.
Hi, I'm Patrick Park from Voice of America. I have a question. You mentioned that North Korea is more likely to use their nuclear weapons in the early stages of the conflict, and so in your book, in your calculation, what's the most likely damage for the U.S. should U.S. engage in a nuclear conflict with North Korea, theoretically?
Yes. Well, so maybe I wasn't adequately clear. What I said was that many critics of American nuclear strategy say that the United States, by having a robust nuclear posture, will encourage weaker adversaries like North Korea to use nuclear weapons first. And I argue that I actually think that that's not the case, that would be illogical for Kim Jong-un. Essentially the logic of the argument is Kim Jong-un is so afraid of a nuclear war with the United States that he intentionally starts a nuclear war with the United States. So maybe he's crazy and would do something like that, but I think he's actually demonstrated pretty good survival instincts over the past few years. And I think he knows that the last thing he would want to do is intentionally start a nuclear war with the United States. So I think we can deter Kim Jong-un, but I do think there are some risks involved. What would the consequences be of a nuclear war with North Korea? It's difficult to know. There are different assessments on how many nuclear weapons he has, whether he has the ability to miniaturize them on missiles or not, what his ability to deliver them is. My own best assessment, for what it's worth, is that he probably doesn't have an operational ICBM capable of reaching the United States right now. So my best estimate is, God forbid there's a war with North Korea tomorrow. I think it likely does not result in nuclear attacks against the United States, but could very well result in nuclear attacks against our allies or bases in Asia. So serious costs, to be sure, which is an important consideration to take into account. But again, on the outside, there's just so much uncertainty about how many nuclear warheads, are they deliverable or not. It's hard to estimate the likely effects with any more granularity. So I'm sorry about that.
Hi, Ian Rohr, student at the Institute of World Politics. My question is, well, there's a lot of speculation of whether Kim Jong-un is considered a rational actor. Does the United States consider North Korea a rational actor? And if it doesn't, do we have a strategy for dealing with the irrational actors?
So a few points. One, a lot of this deterrence theory depends on your adversary being rational, or at least wanting to survive and seeing nuclear war as a bad outcome to be avoided. But it is possible that there are crazy leaders out there who want nuclear war for one reason or another, in which case a lot of this theory goes out the window. My own view is that Kim Jong-un has shown himself to be ruthless, but pragmatic and rational, that he wants to survive, he wants his regime to survive. So I believe that he can be deterred. The other thing I would say is that, if you believe this logic, though, of nuclear brinkmanship, there are real risks of nuclear escalation, even if you're dealing with rational leaders. Because you get into these games of chicken, you take steps to increase the risk of nuclear war, and things could always spiral out of control. So President Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, said the risk of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2. So I don't think any of us think that Kennedy was a madman or crazy, but he was willing to run a 50% chance of nuclear war with the Soviet Union in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what chance of nuclear war would Kim Jong-un be willing to run in a serious crisis in South Korea, or President Putin in a serious crisis in Eastern Europe? I don't know the answer, but I think it's probably more than zero. So I think even if he's rational, there are real risks. But I do think that he's rational. He doesn't have a death wish. And intentionally starting a nuclear war with the United States is not something that he sees in his interest. You're welcome.
Thank you. My name is Vyacheslav Koster. Mehdi, I wonder to ask you, what role of nuclear tests do you see in terms of nuclear strategies, current and previous ones? And how do you assess any changes which were presented in the NPR in this sphere?
Yes. And I'm not sure I caught, you said nuclear tests? Yes. The United States, Soviet Union, other countries conducted a lot of nuclear tests in the past. The United States' current policy is that there's no need to conduct a nuclear test, and that we call on other states to maintain the moratorium that's existed against nuclear testing. Russia, China, Britain, France haven't conducted tests in a long time. But the United States reserves the right to continue testing in the future if for some reason we believe it's necessary to ensure the functioning of our nuclear weapons. Currently, I don't see any reason why we would need to return to testing, but I'm not a nuclear physicist, so you might want to talk to those working at the labs, Livermore and Los Alamos. But current U.S. policy is that it's not necessary for the foreseeable future.
So, throughout the book, sometimes you distinguish nuclear weapons into so I distinction. Considering such
Yeah, so I talk about this a little bit in the conclusion, because one of the major concerns American officials have now is not full-scale nuclear exchange with Russia, but the possibility of limited nuclear use from Russia in a conflict in Eastern Europe, and how would we respond to that? So in the new nuclear posture review, the United States says that if Russia conducts one of these de-escalatory nuclear strikes, that the United States has limited options of its own, that has a lot of different response options, but it could include limited nuclear strikes of our own. And it calls on these the development of new supplemental capabilities, low-yield capabilities that could be used in these kind of scenarios. So that's current U.S. policy. How does it fit into the framework of the book? Well, if these competitions between nuclear armed states is a game of chicken, and the size of the car is the strategic arsenal, I think tactical nuclear weapons are part of the gas in the tank. If you're going to threaten a crash, you have to have the ability to get your car down the road to the other side. And if the adversary uses a tactical nuclear weapon and the United States doesn't have a response, then we face this choice, as Kissinger put it in 1957, between suicide and surrender. We can either go to full-scale nuclear war or back down, which is not what we want to do. So I think we need to have other options to stay in this game of nuclear chicken, increase the risk of nuclear war, and put the onus of further escalation back on the opponent. So that's how I see our nuclear forces coming in. So in my view, I think we need to have rungs on the ladder so we can do that. But I don't see why we would need tactical superiority over Russia, because I don't think either one of us is thinking about fighting a full-scale tactical battlefield nuclear war in Eastern Europe.